Welcome. We tried a bit of wonder, didn't we? So now I thought we'd maybe move on to something that I know a few of you like, because we did it back in the autumn term. So I'm gonna try probably doing it a couple of times a week, to read some different types of story. So today we've got Anthony Horowitz, Scared to Death. So obviously I warn you, these are not for the faint of heart. And enjoy. This story is called Bet Your Life. It was the last night, the grand finale of the quiz show that for 3 months had, in the words of the TV Times, gripped the hearts, the minds, and the throats of the nation. 30 million people had watched the semi-final. Even the royal wedding had attracted fewer spectators. There has never been a programme like Bet Your Life, the TV Times had continued. Forget X Factor, forget Love Island. This is a reality TV taken to new limits, smashing through the barriers, thrilling audiences in a way that they have never been thrilled before. It was filmed at Pinewood Studios near Ivor, northwest of London, and security guards had taken up their positions 24 hours before, hundreds of them armed with sunglasses, walkie-talkies, and canisters of pepper spray to keep back any unruly fans. The programme would be seen in 37 countries, but the studio was only big enough to hold a live audience of 400 people. And competition for tickets had been intense. One ticket had changed hands on eBay for £10,000. A multi-millionaire in Orpington had offered double that sum in an advertisement he had placed in the national press. As the sun began to set and 7 o'clock approached, helicopters buzzed over the studios. Huge spotlights were wheeled into place. The world's press corps made final checks in their mobile broadcasting units, and 2,000 people gathered around the giant plasma screen that had been erected outside to allow them to watch the show live. Inside the studio, in his makeup room, Danny Webster was feeling surprisingly calm. At 16, he was the youngest ever contestant, but, even so, he was sitting in front of a mirror. One or two of the bookies had made him favourite to win. He was sitting in front of a mirror, looking at his own face, as a makeup girl dusted his forehead with powder to stop the sweat showing in the hot lights. With his long brown hair, blue eyes, and still very boyish face, Danny was unusually good-looking, and all the newspapers agreed that, if he won, he would certainly have a career in TV, either as an actor or as a presenter. But that, of course, was only the secondary prize. Danny tried not to think of the black attaché case containing £10 million worth of diamonds that would be presented to the winner in less than 2 hours' time. By far the biggest prize in television history. Danny had always been good at general knowledge. In fact, it was rather more than that. From the earliest age, he demonstrated a photographic memory. He'd been able to speak fluently before he was 2. He'd won a scholarship to a private school and had sailed through all his exams. Although he had never been strong at creative thinking or writing, subjects that essentially required a grasp of facts, biology, physics, geography, maths, had come easily to him, and he'd gained effortless as throughout. It had been his father's idea to enter him into Bet Your Life, when, for the first time, the entry age had been lowered to 16. Gary Webster had been a postman until a back injury put him out of work. Since then, he'd lived on benefits, punctuating the day with visits to the pub and the betting shop. His wife, Nora, worked as an office cleaner, but this only brought in a small amount of money. The three of them lived in a cramped, unattractive flat in a high-rise block in Elephant and Castle. A prize of £10 million would completely transform their lives. Gary had used a mixture of threats and promises to persuade his son to put his name forward. The trouble was that Danny was quite shy and didn't like the idea of seeing his name and photograph splashed across the world's newspapers. And there had, of course, been the fear of losing. But in the end, he had agreed. He was a quiet, rather friendless boy. Perhaps his astonishing brain power, his instant recall, had put other kids off. He didn't like his school very much, and like his parents, dreamed of a new life. His father spoke of a house on the Isle of Wight. The money would make that possible, and more. For his part, Danny wanted to go to Cambridge, Britain's second oldest university, founded in 1209. He dreamed of becoming a librarian, perhaps in the British Library, the Zion, Sir Colin and St John Wilson itself. He would read and remember 1,000,000 books, and maybe one day he would compile an encyclopedia, a compendium of everything he had learned. How many people stood between him and his ambition? To begin with, there'd been over 30 of them. Now just 4 remained. There was a copy of the TV Times lying in front of the mirror, and Danny flicked it open. Know your enemy, as the ancient Chinese warrior Sun Tzu had written in his great book, The Art of War, 6th century BC. And there they were. Each one of them had 2 full pages with a full-colour picture on one side and background details on the other. Richard Verdi, 44. He was the man Danny most feared, round-headed and bald apart from a narrow strip of black hair around his ears, always wearing black trimmed spectacles. He was a professor of history at Edinburgh University. He was very serious, completely focused. Nothing ever rattled him. Most of the bookies had made him the favourite to win. Rafe Plant, aged 30. The newspapers loved Rafe. He was a thin, curly-haired man with a roguish, handsome face, despite his broken nose and crooked teeth. Rafe had been sentenced to 12 years in jail for armed robbery. The trouble for Danny was that he had spent that time taking an open university degree and reading hundreds of books. He was a huge font of knowledge, and with his unconventional background, he was definitely the housewife's choice. Mary Robinson, age 49. The oldest contestant, and the only female, was a computer programmer from Woking. Her photograph showed a slim, unsmiling woman with dark hair swept back and very simple gold earrings. Nobody was quite sure how Mary had amassed her astonishing general knowledge. She gave away very little about herself, although she had let it be known that if she won, she would give her money to charity. She particularly wanted to help look after donkeys in Spain. Ben Osmond, 27. Ben was the only contestant Danny actually liked. They'd met during the audition process and had struck up a sort of friendship. Ben's grandparents had come from the West Indies, and from them he'd inherited a sunny, easy-going manner, treating the quiz, like the rest of his life, as a bit of a joke. He had written poetry, climbed mountains, studied in a Tibetan monastery, and campaigned for human rights. Now he was doing this, and he seemed to be enjoying it. Just 4 faces left. 5, including his. Danny thought about all the contestants he had met along the way. There'd been Gerald, the fat, jolly headmaster from Brighton. Abdul, the taxi driver, had been so certain he would win. Clive in his wheelchair, hoping to claw something back in a life that had been wrecked by a car accident. Susan, who had complained when she had been asked to share a makeup room. So many different people. But they'd all gone now, and in a couple of hours there would be only one left. There was a knock at the door, and the soundman came in with a little microphone that he would clip to the collar on Danny's shirt. Danny had chosen jeans and a simple open-neck shirt for the final, although he'd been told that the other contestants had been offered thousands of pounds to wear and promote designer labels. He'd briefly considered doing this himself, but he felt comfortable in his own clothes, and that was important. Staying relaxed was half the battle. "How you feeling?" The sound man was cheerful as he slid the microphone into place. Theoretically, the technicians weren't meant to talk to the contestants, but Ed didn't seem to care about the rules. "I'm okay." "Good luck. I'll be rooting for you." The makeup girl left with the sound man, and for the next 20 minutes, Danny was on his own. He knew he was nervous. He could feel his heart beating. It was hard to swallow. There was a tingling feeling in the palms of his hands. He forced himself to empty his mind and stay calm. A certain amount of nervousness was perfectly understandable. He just had to control it. That was all. He couldn't let it knock him off course. At last, the floor manager arrived. She was a big, smiling woman in her 20s, always carrying a clipboard and with a large microphone curved around her neck. "We're ready for you," she said cheerfully. Danny stood up. He hadn't let his parents wait with him. They were even more nervous than he was, and he hadn't wanted to be distracted. He knew that he wouldn't see the other contestants as he made his way to the set. The studio had been specially designed that way. Just for a moment, he felt very alone, following the woman down a tatty, cream-painted corridor with neon lights flickering overhead. It was more like a hospital than a television studio, he thought. Perhaps that was deliberate too. But then they turned a corner and went through a set of double doors. On the other side, everything was dark. Danny could just make out the great bulk of a wall made of wood, hammered together almost haphazardly. There were cables trailing everywhere, fastened to the floor with lengths of duct tape. He knew he was looking at the back of the set. Through the cracks, he could make out the studio lights. The floor manager rested a hand on his arm. 10 seconds, she said. The familiar music began. Danny had heard it 100 times, playing at the start of the show, although, of course, it had never come up as a question. He knew that there was an adaptation of a piece by Wagner, the German composer born in Leipzig on the 22nd of May 1813, died 1883. The music stopped. There was a round of applause. Danny felt a hand tap him on the shoulder, and he moved forward into the light. And there was the set of Bet Your Life, with 5 metal lecterns arranged in a semicircle around a central control panel, looking like something out of a spaceship, where the question master would take his place. The lecterns could have been designed for a politician or a lecturer to stand behind when giving a speech. Each one stood on a low, square platform and came up to the contestant's waist with a television monitor built into the surface. Every question was written out as well as spoken, and the screens would also be used if there was a pitch around. The lecterns were black and polished, so they reflected the studio audience sitting in long rows facing them. They looked somehow dangerous, but of course, that was the whole idea. On one side of the stage, there was a giant television screen. On the other, a strangely old-fashioned clock face would count down from 15 to 0. Inside the 0 was a cartoon of a human skull. Danny had already been told which platform was his. The numbers had been drawn completely at randomly so that nobody would have a psychological advantage. Rafe Plant was number 1, Richard Verdi was 2, Mary Robinson was 3, Ben Osmond was 4. Danny was on the edge at number 5. He was glad to have Ben next to him. He studied recordings of the other contestants, trying to work out as much as he could about them, the way they play the game. The professor and the computer programmer had been the most worrying. He'd been struck by how grim and professional they were. And Rafe Plant, with his easy smile, seemed somehow untrustworthy. He would feel less intimidated next to Ben, who was, after all, the closest in age to himself. All 5 of them were appearing at the same time, walking in through separate entrances, dazzled by the studio lights which formed a barrier between them and the audience. Danny could just make out the security guards in their silver BYL anoraks. There were 6 of them, huge men, standing with their backs to the stage, their arms crossed, their job being to make sure that nobody came close. The Wagner was playing, pounding out a bank of speakers. Danny could sense the tension in the air. He could smell it. The heat of the lights was unforgiving, sucking out all the emotions of the crowd and keeping them trapped in the closed, windowless place. He reached his platform and climbed onto it. At once, one of the floor managers, a young man in a black t-shirt, came forward and shackled his ankles into place. Now he couldn't move. He would be forced to stand behind the lectern until the game, or his part in it, was over. In the beginning, this had worried him. Now he was used to it. He moved one foot and felt the steel chain jangle against his shin. The other 4 contestants had been locked in place just like him. He didn't look at them. He didn't want to meet their eyes. The music changed. A circular trapdoor had slid open in the middle of the stage and clouds of white smoke were pouring out. As the audience increased their applause, many of them whistling and cheering, a figure rose up from below, carried by a hydraulic lift. He was dressed, as always, in a black suit with a black shirt and a silver tie. His black hair was slicked back and his black beard neatly trimmed. Against all this, his skin was unnaturally pale. His teeth, a perfect white, seemed almost electric. Wayne Howard, the compere of the show, had arrived. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he began when the applause had finally died down. "And welcome to the final episode of the most dramatic, the most exciting TV quiz show on TV. The 5 people who stand before you tonight have completed an epic journey, but only one of them can walk away with the biggest prize ever offered by any television programme anywhere in the world. And just to remind you what it is, let's take a look. £10 million in diamonds. Bridget, bring them on." Blonde-haired woman dressed only in a silver bikini with thigh-high boots walked out of the wings carrying a simple leather attaché case. She stopped next to Wayne and opened it. As one, the audience rose to their feet. The diamond seemed to catch the light and magnify it 1,000 times. So it was as if Bridget had opened a portal into another world. There they were, a scattering of stones, each one a different cut and a different size, glittering brilliantly on a cushion of dark velvet. "These stones can be carried anywhere in the world," Wayne explained. He had said the same thing many times before. "They can be spent anywhere, and tonight one person is going to walk out of this studio carrying them. Will it be Mary, who hopes very soon to look after donkeys? Will it be Richard, whose career as a professor could soon be history? Will it be our poet Ben? Or how about Rafe? We know he's gone straight, but is he going straight to the diamonds? And finally, there's Danny, our youngest contestant, just starting in 6th form. Could he be the one? It's time to find out on Bet Your Life." More music. Searchlights sweeping back and forth. Wayne Howard took his place behind the central control desk, facing the contestants. The quiz began. The format was actually quite simple. Each round was a series of questions on a specialist subject, randomly generated by a computer and fed to Wayne. Each contestant had 15 seconds to answer, and if they didn't know, they had 3 lifelines. One of these was a pass, which meant that the question was passed on to the person standing next to them. The next was a second chance, which they could play once the question had been asked. It meant that if they guessed incorrectly, they could try again. The last was called Toss of the Coin, They would be fed to 2 possible answers and would have to choose between them. Wayne reached out and pressed the button on the console. The single word science came up on a giant screen above the stage. Danny smiled to himself. Science was one of his favourite subjects. It was a promising start. And the first question is for Rafe, the quizmaster announced. What chemical with the symbol NaC1 is found in the sea and in the kitchen? Danny knew the answer to this one. It was sodium chloride, or common salt. Unfortunately, Rafe knew it too. But that was hardly surprising. All the questions in the first round were deliberately simple. They would become harder as the evening went on, and sure enough, all 5 contestants answered their questions on science without any trouble. The next rounds, entertainment, passed without much incident, but in the one after, politics, there was a moment of drama when Ben had to use his pass. He'd been asked who became president of the USA in 1969, and for some reason he couldn't think. The same question went to Danny, who suddenly found himself sweating as the hands of the clock began its journey. He had just 15 seconds to find the answer. The time pressure making it all the more difficult. Thinking on his feet, he decided to play his second chance lifeline, and it's just as well as he did. His first attempt, John F. Kennedy, was wrong, but that didn't mean he was eliminated. With 4 seconds left, he remembered the correct answer, Richard Nixon. His mouth was so dry by then that he had to force himself to spit out the words. Richard Verdi had a bad round with food and drink. Using his own second chance to answer the question, what alcohol was used as the basis of a mojito? The answer, which he got right the second time, was white rum. He also had to use a pass in the next round, wild animals, so that after 15 minutes and the first advertising break, he was looking distinctly rattled. Danny noticed that so far the computer programmer hadn't so much as hesitated. She could have been reading the answers straight out of a book. The first upset came in the next round, famous films. Rafe Plants was asked the question, who had the title role in the 1931 film of Frankenstein? And with a trademark wink and a grin, he answered immediately, Boris Karloff. There was a long pause. Then Wayne Howard shook his head, and immediately the audience broke into a mixture of gasps and whispers. It was the wrong answer. Danny realised at once what had happened. This was one of the traps that the quiz programme was famous for. It was absolutely true that Boris Karloff had starred in the film as the monster created by a mad inventor. But the film had been named after the inventor Dr. Henry Frankenstein, not after the monster, which actually had no name at all. And the inventor had been played by a much less well-known actor called Colin Clive. I'm sorry, Rafe, Wayne said. He reached down. Behind him, the audience began a chant, as they always did. Go, 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 go! Wayne brought out a submachine gun. It glimmered in the spotlights as he checked that it was loaded. Then he rested it against his shoulder and fired 100 rounds into the unfortunate contestant. Danny could only watch in silent horror. Rafe, chained to his lectern, seemed to be trying to leave the stage in 6 directions at once. He was almost torn in half by the bullets. The noise of gunfire was horrendous. The stench of gunpowder filled Danny's nostrils and throat. At last it was over. The audience shouted and clapped his approval. Rafe slumped forward, his hands hanging down. Silently, his lectern was lowered out of sight, carrying the corpse with it. So now there was just 4 left. Forcing himself to turn his attention away from the square opening in the stage, Rafe Plant's grave, Danny searched for his mother and father in the audience. They had been given VIP places in the front row. Gary Webster was trying to smile, feebly waving a hand at his son. It looked as if his mother had been sick. She was slumped in the seat next to her husband. Her face was pale. Richard Verdi answered the next question correctly. So did Mary Robinson. When it came to Ben Osmond's turn, he seemed rattled after what had just happened. What was the name of the character played by Sir Ian McKellen in the first X-Men film? Ben hesitated and came up with the right answer, Magneto, with only seconds left. Danny liked films, but he was forced to use his precious pass when his turn came. Who produced the original version of The Italian Job? In the back of his mind, he knew somehow that the remake had been directed by someone called F. Gary Gray, but the original had been shot in 1969, almost 30 years before Danny was born. The question went to Richard Verdi. And with a thrill, Danny realised that the history professor also wasn't sure. He could, of course, have passed the question on to Mary Robinson, but he'd already used his pass in the wild animals round. Would he use his last lifeline, toss of the coin? Danny glanced his way and saw the beads of sweat on the bald man's head. I need an answer, Wayne Howard said. The clock was ticking. 5, 4, 3, 2... It was Robert Dealey! The professor exclaimed at the last second. There was another pause. Pauses were what everyone feared. I'm sorry, Wayne Howard said. The correct answer is Michael Dealey. Go, 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 go! The audience began. But that's not... Verdi began. He never finished the sentence. Wayne Howard flicked a switch on his console, and 20,000 volts of electricity coursed through the leg irons and also through the man connected to them. In less than 5 seconds, Richard Verdi was carbonized. Flames burst out of his ears and eyes. There was a terrible smell. Then he crumpled and disappeared behind his lectern. Once again, the stage opened and swallowed him up. The audience was cheering. 2 women in the back row were holding up a banner that read, "Give him the juice, Wayne!" It seemed that their wish had been granted. There were just 3 contestants left. Danny had to force himself not to lose his composure. He'd passed on the film question, and so in a way he was responsible for what had happened. He'd used the second of his lifelines, and worse still, he then had to play toss of the coin in the next round, Greek myths. The question should have been simple. Who was the first wife of Zeus? But with the heat of the lights, the ticking clock, the growing tension, his brain had failed him. 2 names came up on the screen. Hera or Metis. For a second he was tempted to go with Hera. It had to be her, surely. But then he remembered. She'd been Zeus's 3rd wife. Metis, he said. A pause. The audience waited. That's the correct answer, Wayne Howard said. Danny almost fainted with relief. At the same time, he noticed Mary Robinson sneering at him, telling him that she had known the correct answer all along. And now he had no lifelines left. 2 more rounds, current events and the Beatles, and not a great deal had changed. Ben had used 1 pass, so had Mary. Danny was in the weakest position. With the contest almost over, any one of them could still win. Although if Danny had been allowed a bet, he would probably have put his money on Mary. And then came a round entitled Unlucky Dip. The audience cheered when they saw the 2 words on the screen. It was well known that these questions would be particularly fiendish, designed to catch the contestants out. And in this round, no lifelines were allowed. Wayne Howard looked almost devilish than ever as he read out the first question. The Smith family has six sisters, and each sister has 1 brother, including Mr. and Mrs. Smith. How many people are there in the family? If you're playing at home, that's Smith. The Smith family has six sisters, and each sister has 1 brother, including Mr. and Mrs. Smith. How many people are there in the family? It was Ben Osmond's turn to answer. "There are 14 people," he said. Danny's heart sank. He knew exactly how Ben had arrived at the answer. He'd added six sisters to 6 brothers, making 12. Then he'd added Mr. and Mrs. Smith, bringing the total to 14. But he was wrong. In fact, the 6 sisters only had 1 brother between them. There were just 7 kids, and so with their parents, the correct total was 9. "Bad luck," Wayne muttered. "Go, go, go, go!" What had happened? Had Ben let his concentration slip? Had he been tired, or had he simply wanted the whole thing to be over? Either way, the result was the same, and the answer was no sooner out of his mouth than he seemed to realise what he had done. He turned to Danny. "I'm sorry, little man." He shrugged. "It looks like I'm going to have to check out." "Go, go, go!" Wayne pressed the button on his console. The correct answer was already flashing on the screen. Ben didn't move. Danny glanced up and saw a glass cylinder sliding down from above. It clicked into place, completely surrounding Ben. And a moment later, there was a hiss as a cloud of poisonous gas belched out from the floor. Within seconds, Ben was invisible, lost in an ugly white fog that swirled around him. The audience was ecstatic, many of them on their feet, applauding. Wayne pressed a second button, and powerful ventilators sucked the poison out. The cylinder rose. Ben slumped forward. He could have been asleep, but Danny knew his eyes would never open again. He turned away as the platform disappeared beneath the stage. Danny was sure he was finished. Ben Osmond might not have exactly been a friend, but somehow he'd always seemed to be on Danny's side. Mary Robinson, on the other hand, was ice cold and pitiless. She would never make a mistake. She would stand there and smile when Danny finally stumbled, and the £10 million would be hers. When Danny's own question came, he could barely find the strength to work out the answer. Divide 30 by half and add 10. What do you get? The answer was obvious. Half of 30 was 15. Add 10, that made 25. The audience had gone silent. Danny could see the studio clock counting the seconds. 15 seconds. 15 plus 10 equals 25. He opened his mouth to give the answer. No. There had to be a trick. Think again. Divide 30 by half. Of course. You had to think about the exact words. Divide 30 by the fraction 1/2, and you got 60. Well done if you got that at home. There were 60 halves in 30. Add 10 to that. 1 second left. 70, Danny blurted out. That is correct, Wayne said, and the audience applauded. Most of them had got it wrong, and Danny was clearly the underdog. During the course of the show, there'd been a shift in sympathy. Most people in the studio now wanted the teenager to win. Wayne turned to Mary Robinson. How many animals of each species did Moses take into the ark? He asked. Mary smiled. Was she overconfident, or had the pressure finally got to her? The critics would be arguing about it for weeks to come. 2, she replied. Wayne blinked twice. Have you guessed what she said? Wait a minute! Mary's face had suddenly changed. For the first time, her eyes were filled with fear. Her mouth had dropped. The little gold earrings trembled. It was an old chestnut, and she'd fallen for it. Moses didn't take any animals into the ark, she corrected herself. It was Noah. The answer is none. Wayne sighed. That's absolutely correct, Mary. But I'm afraid I have to take your first answer. You said 2, when the answer is none. And I'm afraid that was wrong. Before the audience could even begin its usual chant, he took out a handgun and shot her between the eyes. The single shot was deafening. It seemed impossible that such a small gun could make so much noise. Mary was thrown backwards, disappearing from sight. For a moment, nobody did anything. Then every spotlight in the studio swung round, focusing on Danny. It wasn't quite over yet. One question remained. Wayne produced a golden envelope. Inside it was a question that had been set by the Prime Minister. There were no lifelines, no help from the audience, no second chances. At this moment, it was all or nothing. Wayne took out a silver knife and slit open the envelope. Danny Webster, he said, you are our last survivor. Answer this and you will be our undisputed champion. We're going to give you an extra 5 seconds to help you. How are you feeling? Just ask me the question, Danny rasped. The lights were blinding him. He could feel them burning his brain. All right, here it is. Wayne paused. Can you tell me the name of the biggest library in the world? Total silence. It was as if the audience was no longer breathing. The clock had started ticking. In 20 seconds, Danny would be either very rich or very dead. But he knew the answer. Danny wanted to be a librarian, and he knew that it wasn't the British Library. That was the second biggest, with over 14 million books. It's the American Library of Congress, he said. Another long silence. You're absolutely right, Wayne said. Everything went crazy. The audience left their seats once again, cheering and shouting. The security men closed ranks, forming a barrier in front of the stage. Fireworks exploded and brightly coloured streamers rained down. 2 floor managers ran forward and released Danny from his shackles. For the first time, he realised that he was soaked in perspiration. He found it hard to move. Bridget, the blonde in the bikini, came back with the attaché case. Wayne strode forward and took Danny's hand, at the same time thumping him on his back. This year's winner, just 16 years of age, is Danny Webster. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the youngest multi-millionaire in the country. More cheering. Somehow Danny's parents had found their way onto the stage. His father was whooping with excitement while his mother smothered him in kisses. I knew you could do it, son, Gary exclaimed. You made us. We're in the money. The next 5 minutes were totally chaotic for Danny. His head wasn't working. Nothing made sense anymore. He reached out as the attaché case was pressed into his hands and felt the diamonds rattling inside. Bridget kissed him. Wayne Howard embraced him. It seemed that everyone wanted to touch him, to congratulate him. His name was flashing on the screen in gold letters. The Wagner was playing again. The Wagner, sorry. The security men had formed a protective tunnel, and somehow he was bundled out of the studio and into the cold night air. But even here it wasn't over. There were 2,000 people cheering in front of the giant plasma screen, which showed his own image, blinking as he was led out. The world's press was waiting for him. More than 200 cameras were flashing in his face, blinding him, shattering the night sky. Reporters were shouting questions at him in a dozen languages. There was a stretched limo with a uniformed chauffeur holding the door for him. But there was no way he could move forward, not with so many people surrounding him. His father was laughing hysterically. His mother was posing and pirouetting for the cameras. The security men were still trying to clear the way. It was like the end of a war. And then out of nowhere, a helicopter appeared. It came down so fast that Danny thought it was going to crash. What was it doing? Were there more reporters trying to break in on the scene? He saw a rope ladder snaking down. Then something fell out of the sky. A grenade. Somebody screamed. A second later, there was machine gun fire. Danny saw several of the journalists being mown down. The grenade exploded. Yellow tear gas mushroomed out. Suddenly he couldn't breathe. Tears streamed down his cheeks. Two men dressed in black from head to foot, their faces covered by balaclavas, were climbing down the rope ladder. They weren't newsmen. One of them fired several shots into the crowd, killing the chauffeur and two of the security men. The other ran up to Danny and snatched the case, but Danny wouldn't let it go. He'd won the competition. Over the past months, he had unanswered hundreds of questions. The prize was his. The masked man pulled out a gun and shot him. And at that moment he heard a voice, amplified, coming out of a speaker system that must have been concealed somewhere outside the studio, and somehow he knew that it was being broadcast all over the world. What a fantastic piece of planning by the MacDonald family from Sunderland, who must surely be the winners of Steal a Million, the reality programme that turns ordinary people into master criminals. It looks like they've snatched the diamonds, and now nothing can stop them as they make their perfect getaway. Danny didn't hear any more. He saw his mother staring at him in horror and glanced down at his chest. Blood was pouring out. Then he was toppling forwards. The attaché case was no longer in his hands. There was no pain. A moment later, everything went black, and his one last thought was that, in a way, it was all very much like a television being turned off. There you go.